The sound of oars cutting through dark water, the flicker of torchlight against painted shields, the distant roar of men preparing for battle. These are the images we carry when we think of the Vikings. Warriors sailing toward glory, their eyes fixed on distant horizons, their names destined for legend. But there is another side to the Viking Age, one that the sagas whisper about in fragments, one that history has tried to bury beneath tales of heroism and conquest. It is a side defined not by honor, but by horror, not by courage, but by cruelty. And the deaths that occurred in this world were not clean, not quick, and certainly not heroic. They were designed to inflict maximum suffering, to humiliate, to terrify, and to serve as warnings to anyone who dared to stand in the way of Viking ambition. This is not a story of brave warriors dying with the swords in their hands. This is a descent into the most nightmarish executions and deaths recorded in Viking history. Moments when human beings became instruments of terror and vengeance took on a form so brutal that it echoes through the centuries. One of the most infamous deaths in all of Viking lore is that of Ragnar Lodbrok, a legendary warrior whose name has become synonymous with Norse power and ferocity. But Ragnar's end was anything but glorious. According to the Ragnar saga Lodbrokar and the 12th century chronicle known as the Gesta Danorum, written by the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, Ragnar met his death in a manner so horrifying that it would ignite one of the bloodiest campaigns of revenge in medieval history. In the year 865, Ragnar launched a raid on the kingdom of Northumbria in what is now northern England. But this time, fortune did not favor him. His forces were defeated, and he was captured by King Ælla, a ruler who had no intention of showing mercy to the man who had terrorized English shores for years. What followed was not an execution designed for efficiency, it was designed for suffering. Ragnar was stripped of his weapons and armor, symbols of his warrior status, and thrown into a deep pit. But this was not an ordinary pit. It was filled with venomous snakes, creatures that would have been specifically chosen for their ability to inflict slow, agonizing death. The historical sources describe the scene in chilling detail. Ragnar, once a feared conqueror, was now helpless, surrounded by hissing serpents that struck at him again and again. The venom from these snakes, likely adders native to Britain, would not have killed him immediately. Instead, it would have attacked his nervous system, causing paralysis, internal bleeding, and organ failure. Depending on how many times he was bitten and where, Ragnar may have endured hours of torment, fully conscious, unable to move, feeling his body shut down piece by piece. The saga claims that as he lay dying, Ragnar uttered his final words, a defiant prophecy that would haunt King Ælla, how the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. These words, whether literal or embellished by later storytellers, were a promise. Ragnar's sons would come, and they would bring with them a vengeance so terrible that it would drown Northumbria in blood. And they did. In the years that followed, Ragnar's sons led what came to be known as the Great Heathen Army, a massive Viking invasion force that swept across England, conquering kingdoms, burning cities, and leaving devastation in its wake. And when they finally captured King Ælla, they ensured that his death would be far worse than anything their father had endured. The execution of King Ælla is one of the most horrifying and debated events in Viking history. According to Norse sources, particularly the Ragnar saga, Ælla was subjected to a ritual punishment known as the Blood Eagle. This was not simply a method of killing, it was a statement, a symbolic act of vengeance reserved for those who had committed the gravest offenses against Norse honor. The process, as described in the sagas, was meticulously brutal. The victim was restrained, often face down, and the executioner would use a blade or axe to cut along the spine, separating the ribs from the backbone. Each rib was then broken outward, pulled away from the body to create the appearance of wings. In some accounts, the lungs were also pulled out and draped over the broken ribs, completing the grotesque image of an eagle spreading its wings. Whether this execution actually took place as described is a matter of scholarly debate. Some historians argue that the blood eagle may have been a metaphor, a poetic description of a violent death rather than a literal ritual. Others point to references in the Skaldska Parmal and the Orkneyinga saga as evidence that the practice was real, albeit rare and reserved for the most hated enemies. Regardless of the historical accuracy, the story of Ælla's death became a defining moment in Viking lore. It symbolized the absolute extremity of Norse vengeance, a punishment so severe that it transcended death itself and entered the realm of spiritual desecration. Ælla was not just killed, he was torn apart, his body transformed into a symbol of defeat and humiliation, a warning to anyone who might consider challenging the sons of Ragnar. But the horrors of the Viking Age were not limited to the deaths of kings and warriors. Ordinary people, particularly those who lived in Christian monasteries and settlements along the coasts of Britain and Ireland, faced their own nightmares when the longships appeared on the horizon. One of the most harrowing incidents occurred in the year 870, when Viking raiders descended upon the monastery of St. Abbey at Coldingham, located on the Northumbrian coast near what is now the border between England and Scotland. The Vikings, likely led by Ivar the Boneless and his brother Ubbe, demanded that Edmund renounce his Christian faith and become a tributary king under their rule. He refused. According to the Passio Sancti Edmundi, an account written by Ælla of Northumbria in the late 10th century, Edmund declared that he would not deny Christ nor serve pagan overlords. The Vikings responded with a punishment designed to break him both physically and spiritually. Edmund was bound to a tree and scourged with whips, his skin torn and bloodied. Then, Viking archers began to use him as target practice, firing arrows into his body in a deliberate, methodical manner. They did not aim for vital organs. They aimed to prolong his suffering, to turn his body into a pincushion of agony. The Passio describes him as being covered with arrows like a hedgehog with spines, and still, he did not renounce his faith. Finally, after hours of torment, the Vikings decapitated him and threw his severed head into the forest to prevent Christian burial. Edmund's execution was not just a killing, it was a spectacle, a public demonstration of power and contempt for Christian kingship. For the Vikings, it was a message. Resistance would be met not with a quick death in battle, but with prolonged torture and humiliation. For the Anglo-Saxons, Edmund's death became a rallying point, a symbol of martyrdom and faith in the face of overwhelming cruelty. He was later canonized, and his cult grew throughout medieval England, turning him into one of the most venerated saints of the era. These deaths, Ragnar in the snake pit, Ælla under the blood eagle, the nuns burned alive at Coldingham, Edmund pierced with arrows and beheaded, are not isolated incidents. They are part of a pattern, a deliberate use of violence as a tool of psychological warfare, political dominance, and cultural subjugation. The Vikings did not simply conquer, they terrorized. They understood that fear could be as powerful as any army, and that the memory of a horrific death could linger far longer than the memory of a battlefield victory. These executions were designed to be remembered, to be whispered about in fear, to serve as warnings to anyone who might consider defying Norse power. The Viking Age was an age of terror as much as it was an age of exploration and conquest. The deaths that occurred during this time were not accidents of war. They were calculated acts, rituals of power and vengeance that reshaped kingdoms and carved warnings into the collective memory of Europe. And as the 12th century chronicler Saxo Grammaticus observed, cruelty is remembered longer than valor. The Vikings understood this truth better than most. Their legacy is not just one of longships and distant lands. It is also one of snake pits, burning monasteries, and bodies torn apart in the name of revenge. These are the most horrific deaths in Viking history, and they remind us that beneath the romance of the sagas lies a world of unimaginable brutality.